podcast is real life stories from everyday people recovering from substance or behavioural addictions. Please visit the website www.lifeinrecovery.co.uk for social media links and a range of books by your podcast host and author, Ren Coy.
Hello and welcome to the Life in Recovery podcast, episode 38. Thanks for tuning in. This is going to be quite a quick intro. As you might hear in the background, I've got a little baby grumbling and she needs to be fed. So I'm just going to make this a quick one. First things first, my second Patreon supporter, Emily Yarborough, deserves a massive shout out. So hello Emily, thanks very much for your $5 a month contribution. And I've already done the avatar and put that up on Facebook and sent you a copy via email. So I hope you enjoy that. Thanks again. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/lifeinrecovery. And if you are interested in following me on social media, visit the website www.lifeinrecovery.co.uk for all the social media links and links to my books, including my new book, The Spiritual Malady, How to Attain Peace of Mind and Lasting Happiness, which has been out for a couple of weeks now, and you can find that on Amazon and all good online bookstores. And I hope that none of you have contracted the coronavirus. I think the world is going a little bit crazy at the moment. I happen to be off work on paternity leave, so I'm kind of a bit out of the madness really. I've got another 2 weeks left on paternity, and I suppose I'm quite blessed in a way that I've managed to be away from work over this tumultuous time. I don't really have much else to say about it other than I'm obviously making sure that I wash my hands as often as possible. Everybody in our household is doing the same because, especially having a newborn baby, we definitely don't want her to get sick. So yeah, and just a little bit of a disclaimer on this particular podcast. I'm speaking with a woman called Rachel G, who is a sexual abuse recovery coach and also in recovery herself from addictions that came after sexual trauma when she was a child. So I just wanted to make everybody aware that that's what the majority of the podcast talks about. So it is quite a deep and heavy conversation. Rachel does most of the talking. I was kind of listening avidly and asking questions. And, she was a really, really smart woman, and she has her own take on recovery, which I thought was really valuable. So I hope you enjoy the podcast as much as I enjoyed speaking with Rachel, and here we go.
Hi everyone, Rachel Grant here, and coming to you from San Francisco, California. So nice to be here with you today, Ren.
Lovely to have you as well, Rachel. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm looking forward to hearing your story.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Well, my story really, if we're going to go way, way, way back, we can start when I was 5 years old, growing up in Oklahoma. And I was just a country girl at heart, running around in the fields, having a good time, and my grandfather came to live with our family, which I was super excited about because my older brother and sister, they didn't really pay me much attention. So I thought, aha, here with my grandfather, right? Captive audience. He's all mine. And he really was. I would come home from school and pretty much go straight to his room, and we would play and watch TV and color. We spent a lot of time out on the front porch swing, just kind of watching the lazy country days go by. And he became a companion for me. He became a nurturing, source for me. If we fast forward a little bit to when I was 10 years old, We were sitting out on the front porch swing, and he always wore this orange fuzzy sweater. I can still remember it to this day, and I loved that sweater. I don't know, I'm a redhead, so maybe I just thought ooh, I'm camouflaged when I'm the child of a mind. And so I was snuggled up close with him, and he reached around and began to touch my breast. And I remember thinking in that moment, Ren, that he just didn't realize what he was doing. It was just a mistake, oops, sorry. So I started to wiggle and try to move. And even at 10, I had just enough sense that oh, these parts of my body are mine, or they're kind of different from the other parts of my body. And so was feeling uncomfortable and trying to move around, but he gripped a hold of me tighter.
Yeah.
And in that moment, the panic and the fear, it just all immediately set in, right? My system just became activated. Of course, I didn't know that's what was happening then. I just felt strange and worried and anxious. And eventually I just kind of dissociated. I just froze and felt kind of floaty and didn't really, capture a lot of what was happening, but eventually kind of snapped to, and I jumped up and I ran to my parents' bedroom, and I was, of course, upset and crying. And, it's still amazing to me to this day how quickly, when we experience a trauma, we immediately try to begin to understand it. Why did that happen? What's going on? And as a 10-year-old, I have a very limited landscape of things to draw on. So I immediately was feeling like this was my fault. I must have done something wrong. I must have done something to make him do that. And so all of these feelings, very big feelings, were present that are just overwhelming for my little system. And the abuse continued for some time, and it escalated. It got worse. And then one day my mom just happened to be walking by the window that looks out onto the porch, and she saw what he was doing. And she came out onto the porch, man. She was lit on fire. She was just like, Rachel, get in this house. What's going on here? And at first I thought I really was in trouble, right? She had that kind of tone, right? That she would use, right, when I had done something that I was not supposed to be doing. And so it was confusing at first, but eventually I understood that she was, just trying to get me away from him. And she and my father immediately got him out of our home,
Yeah.
which was amazing. I'm very thankful for that, Ren, because I've worked with survivors of sexual trauma for 13 years now, and I've heard plenty of stories where they haven't been believed. They've been forced to continue to live with the abuser and all of these sorts of things. And so I really give huge, huge props to my mom and dad for showing up in that way for me. And then, they wanted me to get some counseling. They wanted me to get some support. But honestly, I was like, there is no way. Are you kidding me? I am not talking about this. I don't want to even get near it. So I just want to pretend that everything is okay. And I think that that's just a really common experience for anyone who goes through trauma. There is that place in the journey where you're just trying to push it all away, right? Hey, I'm good. Nothing to see here, right? All is well. And but what that meant is that I really spent, the next 16 years of my life dealing with the impact of trauma without really dealing with it. And so during my teen years, I was really struggling around sex. I really had difficulty in, connecting with people, had a lot of self-esteem, went through suicidality, all of those things. And my coping, mechanism was really food. Pretty much from the time the abuse started, I just began, using food as a way to numb out, as a way to feel safe, as a way to disconnect. And that really was carrying on, in my life. So there was a lot of body shame and confusion about that. And when I was 18, I moved to St. Louis to start college, and I met a boy. And we started getting to know each other, and it became really clear to me that I just did not have it together. There are things in your life, Ren, that really show you, you think you have it together, but you don't have it together. And just the way I was showing up in that relationship, the insecurities, the reactivity, and the conversations that I had with him helped me finally face what was going on, that this trauma was still there, still in my system, and still impacting me. And so I did start therapy. Now, the bummer of that story is that this man who instigated healing on one hand also became an abuser on the other. And we spent 10 years together, and we got married along the way in the midst of that. And he was very physically abusive and emotionally abusive. And eventually, when we divorced, I found myself at a really low place in my life. I was in my new apartment, and all I had was a lamp and a sleeping bag. I was just like, whoa, like, what has happened here? How is this my life? How is this who I am? And a lot of fear, Ren, because I did not know how to do something else, right? I didn't understand how to change the course of my life, but I did know in that moment that I had to figure it out, because if I didn't, I was going to spend the rest of my life miserable and just surviving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How
And
the partner that you were with for 10 years, did what was the catalyst for the abuse in that relationship? I'm presuming it didn't start out that way.
no, I think we were, about 3 or 4 months in before, the first incident happened. And we were both volatile. I was volatile at that time in my life, very reactive, a whole lot of anger,
Yeah.
man, just a whole lot of anger. And, we brought the worst out in each other. There were times and moments where we what brought out the best in each other, and there was so much love and nurturing. And I think this is part of the difficulty in abusive relationships, right? There's almost always just enough, like that you say, oh well, but there's all this good here, so let's just keep trying. And I really, the manipulation really got to the point where I really began to believe that I was the root of all the problems, and if I just got myself together, that everything was going to be okay. um we would have just I think we would argue about regular couple stuff, but because I had no emotional capacity as a result of the trauma, and I was so easily triggered, it would go from 0 to 60 real fast. And then on his side, I think it was very, very similar, that, his capacity to navigate those situations. And so, we would get into some knockdown, drag out fights on both parts, to be quite honest. It wasn't always him doing the abusing. And so, ending that relationship was a really just scary moment, because I had become so committed, so determined. Like, my stubbornness is a great quality in a lot of ways, but in this instance, it was really not serving me. 'Cause I was like, oh my gosh, like, give up the ghost already, let it go. And at the time, it was such a painful, painful time in my life. And I didn't know if I was going to come out of that, quite honestly. But looking back at it now, I'm very thankful that relationship did come to a conclusion, and I was able to later, do a lot of work around, now I was healing not just the sexual trauma from my childhood and my teen years, but also, this relationship.
Yeah.
And yeah, and
So
so
at
go
that,
ahead,
at
yeah.
that at that point, you hadn't looked at the sexual trauma from your childhood.
Yeah, I had started kind of in my, 18, 19, kind of into my early 20s. I had started therapy. I had been going to some groups. I went to, I think it was Celebrate Recovery. I think that's still around to this day. Later on, I did a course called Shelter from the Storm. At that time, I was really very religious, and so I was also leaning a lot on, my church community and the Bible, and trying to understand and make sense of things by way of that. And then in my mid 20s, when we divorced, I really just turned my attention. I was like, okay, like, this whole relationship thing, I can't even put my head around it yet. I've got to deal with the sexual trauma first, like, one thing at a time.
Yeah.
And I just became really obsessed with trying to figure that out, and really understand, like, how do we actually heal from abuse? Because at that point in my journey, Ren, I was getting super, super frustrated with the resources that I was accessing. I just felt like every time I would go into therapy, I would spend a whole lot of time kind of giving the history and here's all that happened and here's what's so about it. And then a lot of the conversation just kept revolving around, how do you feel about that? And yes, and making connections of between like, yeah, here's that happened and therefore I have a hard time with like trusting people, or this is where all that anger is coming from. But when I would turn to the person who was meant to be my guide in this healing journey, and ask questions like, okay, well, great. So, but what do I do about that? How do I change that? How do I step into a new way of being? I would get these kind of pat, like, well, you'll find the way, look inside. These kind of BS answers, how do you feel about that? What do you think you should do? And oh my goodness, I was like, look, you're not helping with my rage. I have to tell you.
So you were looking for a bit of direction, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the lack of that, again, this is the stubbornness piece. I said, all right, I'll figure it out myself. And so I just started reading everything I could about trauma. I eventually started a group with the women in my church, and was using the Shelter from the Storm book, but also starting to bring in my own ideas about what it takes to really heal. And once I felt like I was onto something, like I realized that the things that had been working for me was actually transferable, that they would help other people, then I went and I did my master's in counseling psychology and began to study. Along the way in that program, I was introduced to Dan Siegel's work. And ooh, my goodness, his book, The Developing Mind, it just, as we say in the country, blew the barn doors open because I was like, wow, like this is so explaining. The neuroscience of trauma made absolute sense to me. It helped me understand the ways in which I would react and I would respond in my life, the ways in which I would navigate or not navigate relationships. And so I just became very, very intrigued by that and began reading everything I could about neuroscience. And along the way in my master's, I had gone in with the intention of becoming a marriage and family therapist. But I discovered along the way that that was not really in full alignment with what I wanted to do, the way that I wanted to approach healing.
Yeah.
And so I turned and began to look at coaching. And at that time, I didn't find anybody who was doing coaching around sexual trauma. So I just kind of created this lane and said, all right, well, I'm going to make it up. And so I gave myself the title. Back then it was trauma recovery coach, but eventually that evolved to sexual abuse recovery coach. And that's really the work that I do today with men and women all over the country, all over the world.
That is amazing. How long have you been doing that for then?
Yeah, so I kind of count it from the inception of these early groups. So that's 2007, so 13 years.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
I know it's not important, but the question is there in the background, so I need to ask it. Your abuser, your grandfather, whose father was that? Your mother's or your dad's?
That was my mom's father. Yeah.
Okay. And when he was told to leave, obviously when she kind of discovered what was happening, what happened from that point onwards in terms of his relationship with the family?
So he went to live with my aunt. And I pretty much when this all kind of came out, it was a couple of months later, and then and then I was off to summer camp, so I kind of had this nice break from everything. And then he died a year later. So I never had to navigate some of the things that my clients navigate, right? Being at, holidays with, the family and the abuser is invited, these sorts of things. And for whatever reason, I guess the way it was handled, it never really made me feel like my aunt taking him in. It never really landed for me as a betrayal. He was an older guy, he was up there in age. And so it kind of made sense to me. I was like, well, where is he going to go? Right? He has to go somewhere. So it never felt like a betrayal to me. And there were a couple of occasions. I remember one time we were at a family reunion while he was still alive and after this had come out. And that was tricky for me to navigate because I did feel like, who knows? Does anybody know? Does everybody know? That felt a little uncomfortable. And one of my aunties asked me to go in and get him, excuse me, get him up from a nap when it was time for lunch. And that's all, I never talked to her about it before she died. I was always curious, like, did she know and still sent me in there? Because that was a scary moment for me, walking into this trailer and having to like poke him and wake him up. And he kind of lunged at me and I ran away. So, we had that interaction. And then there was a second interaction where my mom, I think in full good spirit, took me over there. And we were sitting, I remember sitting in the chairs next to this bed where he was laying down. And she was saying to him, this is wrong what you did. It wasn't okay what you did. You hurt her. It's not okay. And my grandfather replied with something along the lines of, no, she liked it. This was good for her. And I don't think my mom, bless her heart, it's not, this is back in the 80s. I mean, we still don't know how to handle this stuff now, but particularly back then, there wasn't a lot of education. So, I don't think she grasped how manipulative abusers can be, right? And the cognitive dissonance that so many abusers have, where they really honestly believe that they're doing something good for the child or that the child is enjoying it. And so, that left a mark, and that was part of my healing. I had to, work around that moment and process that. But other than those two instances, he was pretty much just out of my life, and then died soon after.
Well, yeah, I mean it's super heavy, isn't it? Like I'm sat listening to the story and it is like I was just thinking, Jesus Christ, like that, when he said that to you, I mean there's no taking responsibility at all, was there? It was kind of
Right.
literally total denial. And I mean, I suppose I've done enough kind of research and reading into these types of things to understand that the abusers tend to have been abused themselves in some sort of way, or potentially that, the abusers might be addicts themselves. What's your kind of thinking in that kind of sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no clue. What I know of this man's life is very, very limited. I don't know a lot of his history, other than being, a parent to 12 kids, growing, small farm, living on a farm in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and the hardness of that kind of life. I know his family on his side is German and, immigrated over, but I don't know anything about his side of the family, like who was his father, who was his mother, what was it like for him growing up. I know from my mom's stories growing up as, his child, that there was a lot of anger, that there was a lot of abusive behavior towards, like, she didn't call it abusive behavior, she didn't have that language, but there was like verbally abusive behavior towards his wife. And so, when I'm working with my clients, this is always the biggest question on their mind, like, why? It's just always the biggest question. And so, yes, statistically, we know that many people who abuse and who harm people have experienced some sort of trauma and haven't. I think the important nuance that I would add to what you said there, Ren, is they haven't received any help.
Yeah.
Because that's really where the cycle of abuse perpetuates. A lot of my clients have this fear of like, I'm going to become an abuser. I'm going to become an abuser. I'm like, that is really statistically very rare, given that you're here doing your healing work, right? Like it's kind of not on the table anymore. That really occurs when you don't have resources, when you don't have support. And so I think a lot of generational trauma has happened because there was just a complete lack of resources and social messaging that this is what you do, right? Like you spank the kid, you spare the rod, spoil the child, like all of that. It was normalized. It wasn't understood even as abuse for a very, very, very long time. And certainly even in some communities, it's still considered that appropriate, right?
Yeah.
Acceptable behavior. And so, there's been having to deal with just those social influences, and then, lack of resources, and quite honestly, lack of resources for men. Men have not been socialized. This is starting to change some, but men weren't taught, particularly my grandfather's generation, they weren't taught to go to therapy, talk about your feelings. No, like, no way, right? And so, women are abusers as well. We do know that, women abuse children, but statistically, the number does lean towards men. And I think these are some of the reasons why that's the case.
So, how did you overcome this trauma?
Mm. So, it's been a step-by-step process, a wandering path and journey. There's been lots of little things that have happened on the way that have helped me. But the very first thing and the most important thing that started all of the healing was acknowledgement. Coming out of that victim stage, that victim mindset that is really often based in denial and dismissing the experience. It wasn't that bad. Nah, everything's fine. I'm good. That mindset is so protective and so normal, but it prevents healing because we cannot heal what we will not acknowledge. And so, pretty much I made that leap of acknowledgement in my 20s, and I said, okay, yes, this happened. I've got to look at it. I've got to deal with it. And I began doing that work of talking about what I had experienced, beginning to understand the ways in which it had impacted me, impacted the way I felt. And then eventually, when I got to the place of absolute total frustration with just talking about it, I said, all right, enough of that. What am I going to do about it? And when that energy shifted towards that end, that's really where Beyond Surviving, my program, started. And first and foremost, it was really just me trying to get myself together. And the place where I started in that was around understanding the neuroscience of trauma. That was the turning point because I began to understand that my brain had been impacted by the abuse. And then that led to certain behaviors and certain outcomes. And for me, Ren, what really happened was I began to think of this as an injury to my brain and to my nervous system.
Yeah, can we just go into that in a little bit more detail? Because I'm really, really interested in that. So when you say it's like an injury to the brain, I mean, my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong because haven't read a lot about this, but are we talking about the kind of way that the neural pathways are formed as you're developing? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, there are a variety of things that are going on. So we can look at the neuronal pathways. We can look at the actual structures of the brain, like the amygdala, the hippocampus, the corpus callosum, the cerebellar vermis. So I'm throwing off a lot of terms out there, but basically we want to know, like, the brain is comprised of these structures and then of neurons. And the neurons we have billions and billions of neurons in our brain. So many that it's impossible to count. And these neurons, when we are having experiences, they're in charge of kind of the energy of that experience. And so they're firing off and they're building these pathways. The axons of the neurons, connect with each other. So there's this saying that neurons that fire together wire together. So you can kind of think about your brain as this big, huge highway, okay, with all these like overpasses and interconnectings and merge lanes. And we have so many billions of connections as well. But every neuronal pathway is holding the associations of an experience. So what's like your favorite dessert, Ren?
Anything chocolatey.
Chocolatey. Can you think for a moment of like the first time you had like something luscious and chocolatey, like where that takes you when you think about, a chocolate memory?
Yeah, probably like a kind of like a chocolate pudding after my dessert on like a Sunday afternoon or something.
Nice. And so as you're remembering this moment of chocolate pudding on a Sunday afternoon, right, you're thinking about who was there and those feelings, and it's like maybe a warm, a nurturing experience, yumminess, sweetness, right? So all of those associations, and as you're sitting here telling me about that moment in your life, that neuronal pathway that holds that energy of that moment is lighting up.
Yeah.
And because we're accessing that neuronal pathway, we're making it stronger. We're telling your brain, hold on to that memory. Hold on to that associate. I don't want to forget chocolate pudding, right? Hold
That's
on to it.
good.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
And then what's also amazing is that now that you and I have talked about chocolate pudding, the next time you have it, you'll likely think about this redhead in San Francisco,
Yeah.
in addition to that moment when you were a kid. And so now the pathway has become expanded. We have new data, more information. So this is all lovely and well when it's chocolate pudding, but when it's trauma, this causes us to walk out into the world and bump in to data that sets off a neuronal pathway that holds associations that aren't so yummy. So for a long time, fuzzy textures were triggering for me.
Mm.
My brain put together this association between fuzzy and dangerous, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody would give me like a fuzzy something for Christmas or whatever, I would honestly throw it in the trash. I just had to throw it away. You know, I was a very cuddly person, yeah, and in part felt like this association of like being cuddly and close. So when people would try to cuddle me, get close to me, I would feel triggered because that association, that neuronal pathway lights up and says, hold on, hold on, hold on. The last time we were cuddly, these bad things happened. So if you're trying to be cuddly now, these bad things are going to happen again. And so as I began to understand that piece, it was like, okay, so how do we change the neuronal pathways? How do we build new associations? And that is like 90% of the work that I do with my clients is teaching them various strategies that help them achieve that. And this also ties into nervous system regulation because those things are very tied together because once we're triggered, our system becomes activated. The amygdala launches into its freeze, fight, flight, reaction. The nervous system becomes activated, and then that has all sorts of, repercussions and trickle down effects in and of itself too.
So I know I don't want you to give away all your secrets, but can you give an example of how you would kind of like retrain those neural pathways
Yes.
on a negative association?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that we work on in the Beyond Surviving program are what we call autopilot thoughts. So we all have them. There's something that happens and we kind of immediately go to thought. So maybe somebody doesn't return a phone call and your first thought is something like, nobody cares about me.
Yeah.
And that particular belief system is tied into maybe experience of neglect, right? It traces back maybe to trauma where you've been neglected, where you needed support and care and there wasn't somebody there for support and care. And so here in the present day when you're experiencing that, it ignites this whole process and it's off to the races before you even know about it. That's why we call it autopilot thinking. And a lot of people, including myself for a very long time, live in the place of autopilot thinking and they don't have any sense of I can do something about that. So one of the things we talk a lot about in the program is how do we put our hands back on the steering wheel of our brain and of the mind. And so the positive opposite strategy is one such way. You have an autopilot thought. Nobody cares about me. You immediately challenge that with an opposite. Some people care about me. And as you keep reiterating this new thought, it is building a new neuronal pathway. And as you discontinue accessing the old thought, that pathway actually gets pruned. We see this in neurological imaging. The pathway literally breaks apart, Ren, and goes away, right? So it's kind of like use it or lose it. And some pathways we want to lose, right? Get out of here. And so we have to stop using it. And so redirecting our attention to a new pathway, to building a new pathway, to a new thought, to a new belief is just one of, I think, probably the hundreds of ways in which, I teach people to do that.
So It's funny actually because I've got a close friend who's in the 12-step fellowships, and he wrote a little bit of his story for one of my books, and he talked about negative automatic thoughts, so he called them NATs. And
Mm.
his sister had died from cancer, and she was called Patricia, and she was his influence for changing the Nats to Pats because it was Patricia,
Oh.
positive automatic thoughts. So when you were talking, then that just that memory of that story was triggered. But so if I'm driving home from work, because this is an example of how this works for me in my life. So I'm driving home from work, and a thought will come to my mind. Usually, it might be something like, let's say, for example, I've had a bit of a bad day and I've left work early. I've decided that I'm going to go home, might go to the gym or something instead. But then I'll get this feeling of guilt that I've left work a bit early. So I've got a negative thought, and I'll go to the shop and buy some chocolate.
Mm.
And I'll eat the chocolate to make myself feel better. And then obviously I've eaten the chocolate and then I feel bad about myself. So what you're saying is, when that thought comes, I need to replace that negative thought with a positive thought, such as, well, 3 nights of the week I've been working late, and I give it 100% at work every day. That kind of thing. Is that what you're saying?
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a way to go about that. It's, I think the thing to highlight there, which is really beautiful in the story that you shared, is that it illustrates that our thoughts absolutely direct and inform the very next thing that happens, our feelings, our choices, and our behaviors. So when you have the thought, oh, I'm doing something bad and wrong, therefore I am bad and wrong, I need to now soothe that part of me that feels wounded and bad and wrong. And how am I going to soothe that? Chocolate, because we know you love chocolate. Okay, so it makes sense, you know, right? And so your behavior is derivative from the thinking. And so when you shift the thought and you say, you know what, there isn't anything that I'm doing here that's bad or wrong. I'm taking some time for myself, and that's okay. You can
Yeah.
further back that up with other justifications like, well, I've put in these hours here, but you don't even necessarily have to do that. It's just more of a reminding of yourself to yourself that you are not bad or wrong. I'm good, I'm valuable, I'm not doing anything bad or wrong here. Therefore, the feeling then isn't guilt and shame that then has to be numbed out or, resolved in some way. Then it's like, okay, cool, awesome. I'm going to go home and hang out with the fam, or I'm going to go to the gym and have a good workout.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. Because I mean, it's been a huge feature that hasn't in my recovery. That still there's this lingering sense of shame around, some of the things. I mean, I was speaking to my sponsor last night actually, and you know, he hasn't quite got maybe the same language that you're using to delve into this a little bit deeper. But he was kind of saying, you need to be easy on yourself. You need to take it easy. You need to be more self-accepting. But now you've explained a process of becoming more self-accepting. I think I would quite easily be able, well, not easily, but I think I'll be able to, incorporate that type of thinking into my life a bit more.
Yeah, and this is really where the second step in my journey and in the Beyond Surviving comes into play, which is putting an end to shame. Because so much derives from being shame-based. We dismiss our needs and our desires. We feel bad or wrong a lot of the time, being shame-based. We often are looking for external evidence of our value. And so we tie our worth and our value to things like work, projects, accomplishments, money, whatever it might be. And so if any of those externals change or vary, then our goodness, if you will, our value then fluctuates. And so
Mm.
we stay in these perpetual systems. So I think another piece of the puzzle and what you're sharing, and then of course this is just broadly for all of us who are healing and recovery, is that separation piece of our worth and our value from meeting certain standards.
Yeah, and these are all messages that we've received from childhood, aren't they?
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk a bit to that as well? I mean, I suppose I was going to ask you a question actually. I'm just trying to think what it was. Um, no, it's gone. No, yeah. Could you just speak a little bit to the? Oh, that was what it was. It was so I've talked about it a lot on the podcast recently. The adverse childhood experiences study that was done in the 70s. Can you talk a bit about that? How these messages are kind of like, filter down to us, and how they kind of show themselves in later life?
Well, yeah, so Vincent Felidi's work in the acute childhood experiences is pretty fascinating and amazing. And it actually grew out of his study in a weight loss program. He was trying to help people lose weight.
Yeah.
And the people who were losing weight kept dropping out. And he was like, "What is going on? You're succeeding and you're leaving. What is that all about?" And just by happenstance, he asked a question on the intake questionnaire incorrectly, about like your first sexual experience. And the woman replied, "I was 5," or whatever it was. And that got him curious. Okay, well, what's really going on here? And fast forward a whole lot, they did studies and research and began to understand the way that trauma impacts us in a physical way and health way.
Yeah.
And so Nadine Harris Burke, has really picked up his work in a really beautiful way. She's based here in San Francisco and is starting to work to try to get ACE screening to be a standard part of the medical profession, because so many people going in with chronic fatigue, illness, fibromyalgia, like all these various things, it really traces back to abuse and trauma still being in the system.
Yeah, because the majority of people that were obese in that study had actually been sexually abused, hadn't they?
Yeah, quite a
Yeah.
few.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, behavior, here's kind of the bottom line structure that we're always working with. Something happens in our life, or someone says something, and then we interpret that. We apply meaning. There's no getting out of that. That is a human experience, and we need interpretation in a lot of ways in order to make sense of the world, right? Like if I see like a slimy thing wiggling on the floor, I need to interpret that as a snake so I can run and get away, right? But the brain doesn't really care about being right, so it can also misinterpret data, right?
Mhm.
And then if we don't correct that, then we stay stuck in these belief systems and in these patterns. Yeah. Am I answering your question there? Maybe
You
not.
are, yeah, you are absolutely answering my question. And your experience so like of life now, obviously you're a life coach, and you're extremely intelligent and understanding of all these these processes with the brain, etc. How are you applying this in your own life, and do you, because I mean the reason why I'm asking this question is, I've come a long way in 10 years of recovery, but then at the same time, there's always more work to be done, isn't there? And, on the one hand, I don't want to be a perfectionist, but then on the other hand, I believe in, continual evolution, and I feel that change is the only true constant. So where is your life in terms of like your healing from trauma? And do you have any fixes in your life that you still use or not?
Mm, yeah. Well, something I always say is that the Beyond Surviving program is not a program, it's a lifestyle. And our brain, our mental emotional health, is our nervous system health is just exactly the same as our physical being self. So if I, go to the gym for, 6 months, really dedicated, really focused, I'm going to see change, right? My body is going to shift, my body is going to change. And then if I go, okay, great, did that, done, and then I never go to the gym ever again, well, things might get a little flabby. Things might get a little softer. Nothing wrong with that. I'm a curvy girl. I like my curves. But the idea here is that keeping our mental, emotional self healthy requires not that we're like gripping and straining and, always focused on it, but that there is intention there. So I have what I call my protocols, right? And so that's everything from sleep to setting boundaries in my life, to doing some mindfulness work every day, to really paying attention to the language that I'm using in my day-to-day life, because I really believe that language is power, and it's through that we are creating our experience of ourselves and of others. And so if I let my language get sloppy, then my life gets sloppy. The one distinction that I would make, like my personal philosophy, is that we are not meant to spend our whole life in recovery. So I talk about the Beyond Surviving program as being the final stage in recovery. So not the final stage of life, not the final stage of learning things about yourself or growing or discovering things, but this final stage of recovery where like so much of your attention and focus is really on whatever happened that was traumatic in your life.
Yeah.
And instead you have a place, like for me, we know we've stepped out of recovery when the experience is integrated and we can hold it and talk about it with very neutral energy. So for example, I can say, I grew up in Oklahoma. I love peanut butter. I was sexually abused. I will like eat French fries at every meal if possible. Like it's all just, there was two food things there. I love food. So there, it's like, it's just a part of your story. It's not the story. And yeah, is that making sense?
Yeah, no, that is making sense. And an add-on to that question, I suppose, is so. I suppose from what I've just heard you say, you feel like you've recovered from that trauma now.
Yeah, I don't think about it. It's not
Yeah,
like I use it, of course, in the context of my life. And
yeah,
are there parts of who I am that remain as informed and influenced by trauma? Sure.
yeah,
Do I have a system? Do I have higher capacity to navigate that? It's like this, I guess. We have what I think of as our optimized self. Like this is our best, most wonderful self. And I think all of us are striving to be that. This is the self that, responds rationally when somebody's upset with us. you know, this is the self that like does really good self-care, stays grounded, stays connected, doesn't get into a triggered state. And our goal is to live in that optimized self more often than not. But the reality of being a human is that we have, again, so many of these connections that even like there can be things that come along that activate something in us that you're like, whoa, where did that come from? That's a little bit out of left field. So the important thing is not to not, get activated in your life or have a bad day or struggle with something, but it's how do you approach dealing with that? Do you have a really strong toolkit that helps you navigate that in a really empowered way and override the activation so you can come back to that optimized, empowered self?
yeah. I mean, the way that I relate to that is I would say that I'm recovered from alcoholism because I don't ever think about drinking. I can go anywhere in the world, and if there's alcohol, it doesn't make any difference to me whatsoever. I'm completely neutral when it comes to alcohol. But I would say that I haven't recovered fully from kind of like, the what they call the spiritual malady, or just being a human, basically, that obsessive compulsive thinking every now and then, like you said, just having a bad day every now and then and stuff. And I suppose two things are, one, I have a program, as in the 12-step program, which is the way that I live my life, and I live my life by those principles.
Right.
And then the other thing as well is that one thing that I haven't kind of I don't know whether grown out of it is the right term or what, because I'm not sure that I ever will, but whenever I have those negative automatic thoughts that we were talking about earlier, the only way that I have of turning that negativity into positivity or neutralizing it at this moment in time is I have to pick up the phone and ring somebody. I don't have the personal capacity to be able to do what you said earlier. I mean, I've never, to be honest with you, I haven't really tried it, so I will definitely give it a try in the days and weeks coming forward and moving forward. But usually what I would do is I'm thinking about getting the chocolate, so I'd pick up the phone, I'd ring my sponsor, or I'd ring somebody else in the fellowship, and I'd say, look, this is how I'm feeling. And by the time that conversation's finished, I've usually forgotten about the chocolate and I've moved past that emotion.
I love that, Ren. We all essentially what we're looking to do is create a way to disrupt, because otherwise, like our system, I sometimes say like trauma is like the first law of motion. Like it's going to just keep going in the direction that it's been going. So you're going to keep going for the chocolate until there's a disruption. And so if that disruption is call a friend, if that disruption is go for a walk, if that disruption is do some journaling, if it's to do some internal thinking work, if it's to do some somatic, move your body, whatever it might be, do a chocolate dance instead. Like, the bottom line is that we just need to disrupt the pattern. And there are so many beautiful, healthy ways that we can do that. So absolutely, calling a friend is a great opportunity, a great way to step into that.
And this is why I absolutely love this podcast, because I've always said, I mean, many years ago, I used to think before, when I wasn't sober very long, and I thought that the 12 steps was like the be all and end all and the answer to everything. I wasn't open-minded enough to recognize and understand that, people are so different and so unique that you just need to find what works for you. And as you said before before we got into the podcast, you said, like really this program that you've kind of developed is your program for life. And that's amazing. And I think that, if only everybody could kind of be able to implement their own program for living that was really healthy, then obviously things would get much better, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Cheers to that. 100%, for sure.
What does life in recovery mean to you?
So for me, it's really that this life is mine. Like I feel that my life has been reclaimed. My life isn't about trying to deal with past trauma. My life is about present and future. And I have an amazing, lover, partner. I have a beautiful community of people who love and support me. I'm doing really wonderful, exciting things in my business. I'm doing a retreat for the very first, time this year, and expanding my capacity, to show up in the world. And that, honestly, life in recovery in many ways is super boring. Like, I remember this feeling of like, hold on a second, there's no problem, there's no eruption, there's nobody yelling, there isn't anything being thrown. Like, whoa, wait a second, what is this? And my life is really kind of quiet and a little bit boring in some ways, and that for me is gorgeous, everything I ever dreamed of.
Well, I've just finished putting the finishing touches to my 4th book, and one of the things, the subtitle is How to Attain Peace of Mind and Lasting Happiness. And what I talk about all the way through the book is just being contented, and if you can be just contented with boredom, then that's the most beautiful place to be, isn't it? Because that means that you've got a really, really peaceful mind.
Yeah, that's the ticket.
And what if you had to give one piece of advice to anybody that was struggling with any kind of trauma or addictions or anything like that, what would you suggest?
Well, ultimately, it comes down to a choice. And the experiences that we've had, the harm that has been done to us is not our fault. We don't own that. That's not our responsibility. But what is our responsibility is what we're going to do about it. And so at some point, we have to come to the choice and to the decision of taking care of ourselves, getting support, getting guidance, changing, shifting, doing something different. And none of us do that easily on our own. So it's really important to seek out mentorship, seek out guides. That could be me, that could be a 12-step program, that could be a book, but just making sure that you're, connecting in to other perspectives and points of views that are going to help you expand your own mindset.
That is bloody wonderful.
Thanks, Red.
Where can we find you online?
Oh, please come and connect with me at rachelgrantcoaching.com. Down at the bottom, you can get my 3 stages of recovery checklist, where I go into a little bit more detail about the victim, survivor, beyond surviving stages, and what you're wanting to kind of look at achieving in each of those stages, the best types of support to get based on where you are in that journey. And there's all sorts of other resources, and you can certainly learn more about the Beyond Surviving program there as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. It's really, really important work that you're doing. And I was really excited to have this conversation because working in the substance misuse field and understanding, the level of trauma out there. People are suffering, really, really suffering with addictions as a result of this trauma. And I think it's just really important now that, that we all work as hard as we can to get these messages out there. So thanks for all the really great work that you're doing. It's much appreciated.
Oh, well, same to you, Ren. I really appreciate that you've created this space and have created the opportunity for me to come connect with you and your community today. Loved it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you. Take good care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for listening. If you've been affected by any of the issues discussed in the podcast, please see links to a range of mutual aid organisations underneath the podcast link. And please don't forget to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. And you can also support the podcast now via Patreon at www.patreon.com/life in recovery, and you can donate anything you like, really. A couple of pound, £10 a month, whatever you feel that the podcast is worth to you. Is it worth a cup of coffee? So yeah, anything would really, really help to market the podcast and spread the word of recovery far and wide. Please visit www.lifeinrecovery.co.uk for my books and social media links. And if you'd like to get in touch, email me rencoy@lifeinrecovery.co.uk. Peace and love, and goodbye for now.